One father, one bullet, 8 seconds to decide. That night, millions of people were watching a live broadcast when a maintenance worker in a gray uniform, a man nobody knew, nobody noticed, threw himself in front of a child he had never met. He didn't hesitate. He didn't calculate the odds. He just moved. By the time the screaming stopped, he was bleeding on the marble floor, a little girl trembling in his arms, whispering the only thing that mattered. "You're safe now." Then his eyes closed. This is not a story about a hero. It's a story about a father who still had something left to lose, and gave it anyway. Hit like, drop your city in the comments, and let me know how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because what happened next changed everything. The hallway behind the Grand Meridian Ballroom smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet, the kind of smell that only exists in spaces where rich people never go. Ethan Brooks had been working in that hallway since 6 in the evening, crouched under a service panel with a flashlight clenched between his teeth and a diagnostic tablet balanced on his knee, chasing an electrical fault that kept tripping the auxiliary lighting circuit on the venue's east wing. 3 hours into a 4-hour shift, he had already fixed the same problem twice and was beginning to suspect the issue wasn't the circuit at all, but a faulty relay that whoever built this system in 1987 had tucked somewhere behind 18 inches of insulated wall cavity. He pulled the flashlight from his mouth and wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist. "Come on," he said to no one. "Show me where you're hiding." Nobody answered because there was nobody else back there. That was how Ethan preferred it. At 32, Ethan Brooks was the kind of man who occupied physical space without seeming to take up any room. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, in a way that his gray uniform jacket almost concealed, with close-cropped dark hair, and a jaw that looked like it had been hit a few times and healed slightly wrong. There was a scar along his left temple, thin, faded to silver, from something he didn't talk about. His hands were the most honest thing about him. The knuckles were thick, the fingertips were calloused. They were hands that had done a very specific kind of work for a very long time, and no amount of maintenance shifts could completely disguise it. He had been out of the Navy for 3 years. People who knew him from before, the ones still deployed, the ones who sent Christmas cards with unit photos, sometimes asked how he was adjusting to civilian life. He always told them fine. He was mostly not lying. His phone buzzed in his breast pocket. He already knew who it was. He set down the tablet and pulled the phone out. "Dad, are you coming home before my bedtime?" He checked the time, 9:14 p.m. Emily's bedtime was 9:30 on school nights, 9 o'clock when she had a test the next day, and somewhere negotiable in between on Fridays, which this was not. "Working late tonight, Bug. Mrs. Kowalski staying with you?" 3 dots appeared immediately. Yes, but she fell asleep on the couch again. "Her snoring is so loud." He smiled, a small private thing that didn't get to his eyes but got close. "Be nice. Go brush your teeth. I'll check on you when I get home. Okay, love you, Daddy. Love you too." He put the phone away. Then he picked up the flashlight, put it back between his teeth, and went back to the wall panel. Emily was 8 years old. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown, slightly too large for her face in a way that made her look perpetually curious about everything, and a gap between her 2 front teeth that the dentist said would close naturally by the time she was 12, but that Ethan privately hoped never would. She was the kind of kid who collected smooth rocks from parking lots and named them, who cried at commercials for animal shelters, who asked questions about black holes and ocean pressure and why clouds were different shapes with the intensity of someone conducting a formal investigation. She was the best thing Ethan had ever done, and some days that was the only fact that seemed entirely solid. Her mother, Rachel, had died 22 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed late, progressed fast. 4 months from diagnosis to the end. Ethan had been stateside for 1 deployment extension when she got the news, and he'd burned through every favor he'd accumulated in 8 years to get released early. He'd made it home with 6 weeks to spare. He did not think about whether 6 weeks was enough because that kind of thinking didn't lead anywhere useful. After Rachel died, he'd filed his separation papers inside of a month. People told him he was making a mistake, that grief was making the decision for him, that the Navy was structure and structure was what Emily needed right now. His commanding officer, a man named Holt, who had seen Ethan do things in theater that most people didn't survive long enough to describe, had sat across from him in his office and said, with genuine weight, "Brooks, you're one of the best I've ever had. Don't walk away from this." Ethan had looked at him and said, "She's 8, sir. She already lost her mom. I can't also be gone." He'd walked away from it. The maintenance job at Vector Property Services didn't pay well, but it was steady and it was local, and the shifts were predictable enough that he could drop Emily at school every morning and be home most nights before 8. He worked corporate venues, office buildings, the occasional gala or conference event that needed on-site technical support. He was good at it in the same way he was good at most things, quietly, competently, without requiring anyone to notice. Tonight's venue was the Grand Meridian Hotel, which was hosting the Kensington Foundation's annual Tech Forward Gala. Ethan had been inside for 4 hours and had not looked directly at any of the guests once. That was not avoidance, that was efficiency. People at these events didn't want to see the maintenance worker. And the maintenance worker got his job done faster when nobody was trying to make conversation at him about whether the canapés were good this year. He finally found the relay at 9:41 p.m., tucked behind the ventilation housing exactly where logic dictated it would be and where nobody had thought to look. He replaced it in 11 minutes, ran the diagnostic, watched the auxiliary circuit stabilize, and permitted himself a small moment of satisfaction. He packed his tools and rolled the service cart back toward the maintenance corridor, passing a set of double doors that led to the rear of the ballroom stage. Through the crack in the doors, he could hear applause and the amplified murmur of a woman's voice mid-speech. He was not going to look. He looked. Through the narrow gap between the doors, he caught a slice of the ballroom. Probably 400 people in formal wear at round tables, the ceiling dripping with light fixtures that cost more than his car. A stage at the far end where a woman stood at a podium. She was maybe 30, professionally dressed in a dark blazer, dark hair pulled back, the kind of controlled composure that suggested she had been presenting in front of large audiences since before she had any reason to be nervous about it. "What we're announcing tonight," the woman was saying, her voice carrying with practiced ease, "isn't just a program. It's a commitment. A commitment to the idea that every child, regardless of zip code, regardless of background, deserves access to the tools that define the next century." More applause. Ethan didn't care about the speech. He was already turning back to his cart. Then the doors swung open from the inside, pushed by a venue staffer who was backing through them carrying a cable coil and nearly collided with him. Sorry, maintenance?" The staffer glanced at Ethan's uniform. "You fixed the lights on the east side? They've been flickering all night." "Fixed it about 10 minutes ago." "Oh, thank God." The staffer exhaled. "Ms. Kensington's been on us about it since 6 o'clock. She's very particular about the—" "I know," Ethan said, because he had been told 4 separate times that evening that Ms. Kensington was very particular. The staffer propped the door open with his hip and gestured vaguely. "You can cut through the back here if you need to reach the West Service corridor. It's faster than going around." Ethan considered the narrow path along the back wall of the ballroom versus the 10-minute detour through the loading area. "Thanks," he said, and took the shortcut. He kept his head down in his cart close to the wall. Up on stage, the woman, Ms. Kensington, apparently, was still speaking. He caught pieces of it as he moved. "And I want to bring out someone very special to me. My daughter, Lily. Lily, come on up here." A ripple of warmth moved through the audience. The particular softness that rooms full of adults tend to produce when a child appears unexpectedly. Ethan glanced up once, involuntarily, toward the stage. A small girl, 8, maybe 9 years old, with her mother's dark hair and an expression of mortified concentration that was trying very hard to look brave, was walking across the stage toward the podium. She was wearing a dress that was clearly uncomfortable and shoes she wasn't used to, taking careful steps like she was performing a task she had rehearsed but now deeply regretted agreeing to. Ethan felt something in his chest that was not professionally relevant. He looked back at the floor and kept moving. He was 12 feet from the West Service corridor exit when something made him stop. He had spent 8 years learning to trust that particular sensation. The thing that wasn't quite a sound, wasn't quite a sight, was more like a shift in the texture of a room's attention. In Fallujah, it had been the absence of noise in a street that should have had noise. In the Kunar province, it had been a shadow moving at the wrong angle. You couldn't explain it to civilians. You could only tell them that you learned to listen to it if you wanted to keep coming home. Right now, it was a man standing near the third pillar on the ballroom's west wall. There was nothing obviously wrong with him. He was wearing a black server's jacket, which fit the venue. He was holding something against his side, partially obscured by the jacket panel. He was looking at the stage. His weight was slightly forward. Ethan's brain completed the assessment in the time it took him to exhale. The jacket's wrong. It's a size too large, deliberate. His right hand is inside the jacket. He's not watching the speech. He's watching the child. Ethan's hand released the service cart handle. His eyes swept the room, fast and flat. Security was positioned at the doors. The venue's private detail was clustered near the main entrance, the stage-left stairs, and the VIP table at the front. Nobody was covering the west wall. Nobody was watching the third pillar. He looked back at the man. The man's right arm was beginning to move. Later, people would ask Ethan what was going through his mind in that moment. Reporters, podcasters, a congressional aide who cornered him in a hospital hallway with a notepad. They all wanted the same thing. They wanted him to describe a calculation, a decision, a moment of moral clarity. What actually went through his mind was, Emily would be the same age as that kid, and then he was already moving. He didn't run. Running across a crowded ballroom floor creates noise and causes people to turn and look, and creates exactly the kind of disruption that tells a trained shooter to accelerate the timeline. He moved fast and low and deliberate, cutting between tables, using the ambient noise of the audience's attention on the stage as cover. His eyes never left the man at the third pillar. 12 feet, 10 feet. The man's right arm was fully extended now, something dark in his hand. 8 feet. Someone at a nearby table noticed Ethan moving wrong, too fast, too focused, and opened his mouth to say something. 5 feet. Ethan hit the man with his full weight from the side, driving his shoulder into the man's gun arm at the same moment he closed his left hand over the weapon. The shot went into the ceiling. Plaster dust. Someone screamed. The room erupted. Ethan had the gun hand controlled, his knee into the man's midsection, the weapon angled away from the crowd. The man was strong. Trained strong, not gym strong, which was a different and more specific problem, and he drove an elbow back into Ethan's ribs hard enough to separate them from the table he'd just crashed into. Ethan felt it, but it didn't register as pain yet, just information, and the information was he knows what he's doing, end this fast. He torqued the gun hand, felt something give, stripped the weapon. The man went for a secondary, a blade, and Ethan caught the wrist, redirected, put the man's face into the pillar with controlled force. The man dropped. 4 seconds, maybe 5. Ethan came up from the floor with the stripped weapon, blood from somewhere running into his left eye, breathing hard. The room was in chaos, people standing, chairs knocked over, shouting, cascading from table to table in waves. Security was finally moving, converging on his position, guns drawn, nobody yet sure who was the threat. On stage, the podium was empty. Charlotte Kensington was on her knees behind it, pulling her daughter against her chest, shielding the girl's body with her own. Ethan's eyes swept the room again. Old habit. The same one that had kept him alive across 3 deployments and 2 combat zones, and a handful of things that didn't make it into official reports. First contact is distraction. Count the shooters. Count them. West wall, pillar 3. Neutralized. East gallery, upper level. There. The second man was higher up, in the mezzanine that ran along the east side of the ballroom, positioned at the railing with clear sightlines to the stage. He had been the primary. The first man had been the diversion, something to pull security and create chaos while the real shot was lined up from elevation. He had already found his target. Ethan had maybe 2 seconds. He did the math and didn't like the answer. He was on the ground floor. The mezzanine was 20 feet up. He couldn't reach the shooter. He couldn't pull the handgun he'd stripped and use it at this distance. Not with 400 panicking civilians between him and a clear shot. Not with his own vision compromised. Not with security already swinging weapons in his direction without knowing who he was. What he could do was get to the stage. He ran. Later, the security footage, which would be watched approximately 47 million times in the first week of its existence, showed 17 seconds between the first shot and what happened next. In those 17 seconds, Ethan crossed the ballroom floor at a flat sprint, vaulted the stage stairs in 2 strides, and reached the little girl approximately 1 second before the second shot was fired from the mezzanine. He threw himself over her. Not heroic, not cinematic, just the fastest way to put as much mass as possible between the bullet and the child. The round hit him in the upper left back, lateral to the spine. He felt it as heat, then pressure, then the floor coming up fast. He landed on his side, the girl pulled against him, one arm wrapped around her shoulders, holding her face turned away. She was shaking, or he was. He couldn't tell which. "Hey," he said. His voice came out lower than he intended, rougher. "Hey, look at me." She didn't want to. She kept her eyes pressed shut, her whole small body rigid with the animal certainty that if she didn't move, didn't look, it would stop. "Look at me," he said again. "Just at me. Not anywhere else. Just here." She opened her eyes. She had gray eyes. He noticed that in the strange, slow way you notice irrelevant things when your body is already beginning to go into shock. Gray eyes with dark lashes, filling with tears, locked on his face with the desperate focus of someone grabbing the only solid thing in the room. "You're safe now," Ethan said. Then the light seemed to tilt. Then the ceiling. Then there was noise all around him. Voices, footsteps, the hard, flat bark of security calls. Someone pressing against his back saying words he couldn't fully parse. And underneath all of it, the girl's voice, small and very close. "Don't go. Please don't go." He wanted to tell her he wasn't planning on it. He opened his mouth to say something like that. But by then, Charlotte Kensington had reached them, crashing to her knees on the stage in a dress that was not built for that, pulling Lily against her chest with a sound that wasn't quite a word, wasn't quite a scream, was just the pure, uncontrolled register of a mother's terror finding its other side. And her eyes, dark and wet and very still, landed on Ethan's face with a look that he registered for only a fraction of a second before everything went dark. He thought, in the last coherent moment before consciousness dissolved, "Emily's going to be so annoyed I missed her bedtime." Then nothing. But he came back to himself in pieces. First there was pain, deep, specific, unignorable, the kind that tells you immediately you're alive because dead doesn't hurt like this. Then there was white light. Then there was a beeping that was rhythmic and mechanical and institutional in a way that placed him precisely without needing to open his eyes. Hospital. Okay. He opened his eyes. The ceiling was acoustic tile. There was an IV in his right arm. There was a tube running somewhere he didn't enjoy thinking about. The room smelled like antiseptic and the particular sweetness of medical-grade oxygen. He was alive. He did a brief internal inventory. Left side wasn't moving the way he wanted it to, which tracked. His ribs on the right side were wrapped. His head felt like it had been recently emptied and then refilled with something slightly denser than his original brain. He turned his head. Emily was asleep in the chair beside his bed. She was curled sideways, her knees drawn up, her head resting against the chair's arm in a way that was going to be very uncomfortable when she woke up. She was still wearing her school clothes, the blue hoodie, the jeans with the iron-on patch over the right knee that she'd put on herself and applied slightly crooked. Her sneakers were still on. One of them was untied. He stared at her for a long time. She looked so much like Rachel when she slept. The same way of going completely still, completely inward, as if even in sleep she was thinking about something. He reached out slowly and covered her hand with his. His arm was heavier than it should have been. She woke up immediately. "Dad." She was upright before she was fully conscious, her eyes finding his face with the particular alertness of a kid who had been sleeping light and scared. Then her face did something complicated. All the things she'd been holding back for however long she'd been sitting in this chair, and she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his arm and didn't make a sound. "Hey, Bug," he said. His voice was still rough. "How long have you been here?" She pulled back and looked at him. Her eyes were red-edged. "Since last night. I saw it on Mrs. Kowalski's phone. I made her bring me." "You made her?" "I told her I was going to call a cab if she didn't." He looked at his 8-year-old daughter. You don't know how to call a cab. I know, but she didn't know I didn't know. She wiped her face with her hoodie sleeve. You got shot. Yeah. That was really stupid. Yeah, he agreed. She was quiet for a moment. Then, there's a lady outside. She's been out there since this morning. The nurses keep telling her she has to leave, but she doesn't leave. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. What does she look like? Fancy, dark hair. She has a little girl with her who keeps falling asleep on her lap. Emily paused. She looks like she was crying for a long time, but stopped because she ran out. He thought about gray eyes. He thought about, please don't go. Did you talk to her? He asked. No. Emily looked at her hands, then back at him. She talked to me. She asked if I was your daughter. I said yes. Another pause. She said you saved her daughter's life. Ethan said nothing. Did you? Emily asked, very quietly. Not accusing, just asking the way she asked about black holes and cloud shapes, because she genuinely needed to know. He looked at her. There was a little girl, he said. She was about your age, and she was scared. Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, once, slowly, like she'd gotten the answer she was looking for, and it was the right one, and she wasn't sure how she felt about that yet. Okay, she said. She reached out and carefully held his hand, avoiding the IV. Okay. They sat there in the quiet of the hospital room, the monitor beeping its steady rhythm, the morning light coming gray and thin through the window blinds. From somewhere outside the door, Ethan could hear the low murmur of voices, the sound of someone shifting in a waiting room chair, the soft presence of people who weren't leaving. His left side ached profoundly. His ribs were a consistent complaint. His head still felt assembled slightly wrong. He held his daughter's hand and looked at the ceiling and thought, with the particular clarity that severe blood loss and 30-something hours of unconsciousness sometimes provides, that he had made the right call. He didn't know what came next. He had no framework for what came next, because nothing in his life had prepared him for being the man on the news, the name in the headline, the figure that other people were now organizing their feelings around. He was a maintenance technician from a 2-bedroom apartment in southwest Baltimore who was 3 months behind on his daughter's dental coverage and had not bought new work boots since the previous spring. That was the actual inventory of his life, not the footage, not whatever the news was saying, not the lady in the hallway with the dark hair who looked like she'd been crying for a long time and run out. He was just Ethan. He'd been Ethan before the ballroom, and he intended to stay Ethan after it. He just had no clear idea yet what that was going to look like. Outside the window, Baltimore was waking up, gray and honest and unheroic, the way it always did. Somewhere across the city, his apartment was sitting unlocked with Emily's dinner dishes still in the drying rack and a half-finished diagnostic report on his laptop that was technically due to his supervisor by Monday. He was going to have some explaining to do. He let out a slow breath and looked at his daughter again, at the way she was holding his hand with the careful, deliberate intensity of someone who had learned recently that people could disappear and was taking no chances. I'm not going anywhere, he told her. She looked at him with her mother's eyes. You literally just got shot, Dad. I know. And you keep saying stuff like that, like it's supposed to make me feel better. Does it? She considered. A little, she admitted. But you also have to actually not get shot again. That's a reasonable request. It's not a request. She tightened her grip. It's a condition. He looked at her. This small, serious, infuriating, remarkable person who was half his and half Rachel's and entirely her own, and felt something in the region of his chest that had nothing to do with the bullet wound. Okay, he said. Deal. Outside the room, the hallway was quiet, but not empty. It would not be empty for a very long time. The hallway outside room 412 at Johns Hopkins Medical Center had become its own small ecosystem by the second day. There were flowers. Too many flowers, the kind that arrived in waves from people who had watched the footage and needed somewhere to put what they felt. A nurse named Darlene had started stacking them along the wall in a way that was clearly her attempt at organized dignity, but had gradually become an overwhelming floral corridor that smelled aggressively of lilies and made at least 2 orderlies sneeze every time they passed through. There were cards. There were a few stuffed animals, which nobody had authorized and nobody seemed willing to remove. There was a news van parked outside the hospital's main entrance that had been there since 6 a.m. on Saturday and showed no signs of leaving. Ethan knew about the news van because Emily had reported it to him with the particular energy of someone delivering intelligence from a forward position. "There are 4 of them now," she told him on Sunday morning, perched on the edge of his bed with a hospital pudding cup she'd acquired through methods he hadn't asked about. "The lady with the blonde hair keeps doing her hair in the reflection of the sliding doors, and the security guard is very annoyed about it." "I'm sure he is." "One of them tried to ask me a question when Mrs. Kowalski brought me in this morning." Ethan looked at her. "What did you say?" Emily licked her spoon. "I said I wasn't allowed to talk to reporters. Then I walked away very fast." She paused. "Mrs. Kowalski kind of accidentally hit the guy's microphone with her purse. She said it was an accident." "Was it?" Emily considered this with visible seriousness. "Probably not entirely." He almost smiled. His ribs made him paid for it immediately, a sharp reminder from his body that humor remained a luxury for people who hadn't been shot 6 days ago. He shifted against the pillows and tried to find the position that made the left side complain least, which was a negotiation he'd been losing consistently. The surgical team had been cautiously optimistic, which in Ethan's experience was doctor language, for it could have been much worse, and we'd like credit for that. The bullet had entered lateral to the thoracic spine, missed the cord, clipped the lower lobe of his left lung, and lodged against the inside of the posterior rib cage, where a surgeon named Dr. Anand Mehta, compact, precise, speaking in the measured cadences of someone who had learned English as a third language and used it more carefully than most native speakers, had retrieved it during a 2-hour procedure that Ethan had been unconscious for and was now reconstructing primarily from other people's descriptions. "You were extraordinarily fortunate," Dr. Mehta had told him during rounds on Saturday, reading from his chart with the kind of focus that suggested he was choosing words with intention. 2 centimeters to the right, and we are having a very different conversation." "How different?" Dr. Mehta had looked at him over the chart. "The kind where only one of us is talking." Ethan had appreciated the honesty. What he was appreciating less was the rest of it: the flowers, the cards, the news vans, the fact that his supervisor at Vector Property Services had called to tell him, with genuine emotional difficulty in his voice, that the company was covering his medical costs, which was a sentence that made no grammatical sense within the framework of Ethan's employment contract, and which he was fairly certain meant someone external had made a phone call. He didn't know who yet. He had a working theory. The theory was sitting in the family waiting area 2 doors down, where she had been, with varying degrees of consistency, for the past 4 days. He hadn't seen Charlotte Kensington directly since the stage. He'd been unconscious for the first 30 hours. And in the fragmented days since, whenever the door to his room opened, it had been a nurse or Dr. Mehta or Emily or, twice, a hospital administrator who seemed to be there primarily to ask gentle questions about insurance that Ethan answered with the flat patience of a man who had been having uncomfortable conversations about money since Rachel died. But he knew she was out there. Emily had confirmed it. One of the nurses, a young woman named Tracy, who had told Emily that she'd watched the footage 11 times and cried at least 8 of them, had mentioned it with the kind of careful neutrality that indicated she was sharing information she knew was loaded. "The lady, Ms. Kensington, she asked about you this morning, asked if you were comfortable, if you needed anything." "What did you tell her?" Tracy had straightened his IV line unnecessarily. "I said you were recovering well and that I'd pass along her concern." "Good." "She's been here every day." "I know." Tracy had looked at him with the specific expression of someone waiting for him to perform an emotion he wasn't currently producing. When he didn't, she'd finished checking his chart and left. He was not performing the emotion because he was still in the process of sorting out what the emotion actually was. Charlotte Kensington was, as far as he understood, one of the more powerful technology executives in the Mid-Atlantic region, the founder of a company whose name had been on the venue banners, a woman who ran a charitable foundation and apparently gave speeches in front of 400 people without visible nerves and was, by every available indicator, a person who was accustomed to determining the shape of the rooms she was in. She also had a daughter with gray eyes who had grabbed his arm in the last conscious moment he could clearly remember and said, "Please don't go." Those were two very different categories of information, and he hadn't fully integrated them yet. On Sunday afternoon, the door opened, and it wasn't a nurse. Charlotte Kensington was, in person and in daylight and in clothing that was significantly less formal than a gala blazer, a different kind of presence than the figure he'd glimpsed on stage. She was wearing a dark green sweater and dark slacks, and her hair was down, and she looked like someone who had been sleeping in 4-hour increments for a week, which, he would later learn, was accurate. She had a coffee cup in each hand, which was either thoughtful or tactically smart, because it meant she was carrying something and therefore wasn't empty-handed, and therefore had a reason to be standing in a doorway. She stopped when she saw he was awake and looking at her. Something moved across her face. Relief, and underneath the relief, something raw that she pulled back quickly. "I can come back," she said, "if this is a bad time. You've been sitting in the hallway for 4 days. She paused. "Emily told you that." "Emily tells me most things." Charlotte looked at the coffee cups, then at him. "I didn't know how you took it. I asked the nurse and she said she wasn't allowed to share preferences, which I thought was a little—" She stopped. "Black. I brought it black. If that's wrong, I can—" "Black is fine." She crossed the room and set the cup on the tray table beside his bed with the careful deliberateness of someone who was managing multiple competing impulses at once. Then she sat in the chair beside the bed, the same chair Emily occupied whenever she was there, and held her own cup with both hands and looked at him. He looked back. She had the particular quality of stillness that people develop when they've learned to control rooms by not moving. But underneath it, there was something that wasn't controlled at all. Something that had probably been uncontrolled since the moment she'd pulled her daughter against her chest on a stage while a maintenance worker bled next to her. "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you," she said, "for 4 days. I've written things down and crossed them out. I had someone on my communications team draft something, which I looked at for about 30 seconds before I threw it away because it was completely wrong." She paused. "So I'm just going to say the actual thing." "Okay. You saved my daughter's life." Her voice stayed even, but it cost her something to keep it that way. "You didn't know her. You had no reason to do what you did. You ran toward a gunman in a room full of people who were running the other direction, and then, when you realized there was a second one, you covered my daughter with your body." She stopped, breathed. "You were a stranger to her. You were a stranger to me. And I don't have a framework for that. I've been trying to find one for 4 days, and I can't." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Outside, the hospital made its usual ambient sounds. A cart rolling by, voices at the nurse's station, the distant elevator chime. "She was 8 years old," he said finally. Charlotte looked at him. "I'm not being modest," he said. "I'm telling you the actual thing, since that's what we're doing. She was 8 years old and she was scared and she was the same age as my daughter. And I didn't think past that." He paused. "I'm not sure that's the kind of heroism people are expecting, but it's what happened." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "I know about Emily," she said. "I hope that's not—" She caught herself. "I did some research. I wanted to understand who you were. I found your service record. I found—" She stopped again. "I found your wife's obituary." He said nothing. "I'm sorry," Charlotte said, "about Rachel. I'm sorry." The name in her mouth was strange. Not wrong, exactly, just strange. The way it was always strange when people who hadn't known Rachel said her name, like they were holding something fragile they'd been handed without warning. "It's been almost 2 years," he said. "That doesn't make it smaller." He looked at her. She held his gaze without flinching, which he noticed. A lot of people flinched when the subject of Rachel came up, either from discomfort or from the mistaken belief that looking away was a kindness. "No," he said, "it doesn't." They sat with that for a moment. The coffee was good. Actually good, not hospital-adjacent good, which meant she'd gone somewhere specific to get it, and that was its own small information. "Where's your daughter?" he asked. Charlotte's expression shifted. "Downstairs in the children's waiting area. There's a volunteer down there with some kind of craft project, and Lily has been aggressively involved in it for the past hour. A pause. It's been a hard week for her. She doesn't sleep well. She keeps asking about you. She looked at her hands. She asked if you were going to die. What did you tell her? I told her no. Charlotte met his eyes. I said it like I knew it for a fact, which I didn't at the time. She needed to hear it said that way. She paused. I hope I wasn't wrong. You weren't. Something shifted in her face again. The same thing he'd seen in the doorway, relief at the bottom of it, and something else he didn't have a name for yet. She wants to meet you, Charlotte said. Formally. She was awake when you were brought off the stage. She saw more than I wanted her to see. A beat. She's 8 years old and she's been carrying around what she saw, and I think meeting you when you're upright and talking would help her put it somewhere. Ethan thought about gray eyes and a small hand on his arm. Whenever she's ready, he said. Charlotte nodded. She looked like she was about to say something else. And then the door opened and Emily appeared, slightly out of breath, holding a paper bag from a deli down the street that she had clearly made Mrs. Kowalski walk to. Emily stopped when she saw Charlotte. She looked at Charlotte. She looked at her father. She held up the bag. I got a turkey sandwich, Emily said. The nurse said you can have solid food now. I also got chips because the chips here are terrible. She paused, clearly processing the situation. Sorry, I didn't know you had company. It's fine, Ethan said. Emily, this is Ms. Kensington. Emily looked at Charlotte with the direct evaluating attention of an 8-year-old who had not yet learned to disguise appraisal as politeness. You're the mom, she said, from the stage. Yes, Charlotte said. I am. Your daughter was on TV, Emily considered. She looked scared. She was. Is she okay? She's getting better. Charlotte looked at Emily with an expression that had something careful and genuine in it. She's downstairs right now, actually. Emily absorbed this. Then she crossed to the bed and set the paper bag on her father's tray table and sat on the edge of the mattress with the proprietorial ease of someone reclaiming their space. But she kept looking at Charlotte. My dad got shot, Emily said. It wasn't accusatory. It was just the fact stated plainly, the way Emily stated most things. I know, Charlotte said. He did. Because of your daughter. Emily. Ethan's voice was level. I'm not being mean, Emily said, still looking at Charlotte. I'm just saying what happened. Charlotte met the 8-year-old's gaze without deflecting. You're right, she said. That's what happened. Emily was quiet for a moment. Something in her posture shifted, not softer exactly, but less braced. She reached into the paper bag and produced the sandwich and began unwrapping it with focused attention. Did you eat today? Emily asked, and it took Ethan a moment to realize she was asking Charlotte, not him. Charlotte blinked. Yes, earlier. You look like you didn't. Charlotte opened her mouth, closed it. A short, involuntary sound escaped her that was almost a laugh, not humor exactly, but the specific sound of a person whose defenses had been breached by something they weren't expecting. I had coffee, she said. Emily looked unimpressed. She reached back into the bag and produced a second wrapped item. I got 2, she said, and held it out. Charlotte took it. Ethan watched his daughter, who had spent 5 days being scared and pretending she wasn't, and had now, apparently, decided on a different approach, and he felt the thing in his chest again. The one that wasn't a bullet wound. He picked up his coffee and didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything that needed saying. The investigation, as it turned out, had been moving fast while Ethan was lying in his hospital bed becoming national news. He learned the details in fragments, from a detective named Reyes who came in on Monday with a thin folder and a careful manner, from a 2-minute segment that Emily watched on her tablet before he could redirect her, from a conversation Charlotte had with him 2 days later that she clearly found difficult. The 2 men from the ballroom were professionals, not in any organizational sense that had yet been confirmed, but in the operational sense, which meant they'd had surveillance time, access procurement, a coordinated plan. The first man, the one Ethan had taken down at the third pillar, had a prior record under 3 different names in 2 different countries. The second, the one in the mezzanine, was still being held pending federal charges and apparently wasn't talking with any enthusiasm. The target, according to Detective Reyes's careful phrasing, appeared to have been the child. Ethan had let the detective talk, asked clarifying questions, and said nothing about the particular cold that settled in his stomach when he confirmed what he'd already figured out from the geometry of the room and the shooter's positioning. Someone had planned this specific thing, had planned it carefully, in advance, with operational precision, and the intended outcome had been a dead 8-year-old at a charity gala. He didn't ask the obvious next question during that meeting because Reyes wasn't there to answer it, and also because he needed to think about it without anyone watching him think. The obvious question was, who hated Charlotte Kensington enough to target her daughter? He thought about it. He wasn't actively investigating. He was a recovering patient in a hospital room, not an operator, and that was a distinction he'd been making deliberately for 3 years. But thinking was involuntary. The assessment mechanism was still there, running in the background, and it had opinions. Charlotte came in on Wednesday morning looking like she'd made a deliberate decision about something the previous night and had committed to it. She was carrying coffee again. She'd apparently adopted this as her contribution to their evolving dynamic, which he didn't object to. And she sat in the chair and told him, with the flat directness of someone who had decided that managing information was more dangerous than sharing it, what she knew. There was a business dispute, a significant one, an ongoing, involving intellectual property, and a licensing agreement that had gone badly wrong, and a former partner whose name was currently in the hands of federal investigators, and who had the resources and the motive, and apparently the absence of conscience to do what had nearly happened at the Grand Meridian. My legal team has known about him for 8 months, Charlotte said. The threats have been escalating. We had private security, we had a threat assessment, we had... She stopped, put down the coffee. We had a plan. The plan was wrong. A pause. My daughter nearly died because the plan was wrong, and a man I'd never met is in a hospital bed because I didn't take the right kind of precautions, and I have been living with that since the moment I watched you go down on that stage. Ethan looked at her. You couldn't have predicted. I should have. Her voice didn't waver, but it was thin. I'm the one who brought Lily onto that stage. I made that decision. I thought it was safe. I thought the threat assessment was conservative and the security was adequate, and it was a controlled environment. She met his eyes. I was wrong about all of it. He recognized the specific quality of what she was carrying. He'd seen it in the mirror before, the arithmetic of a decision that seemed reasonable at the time and turned catastrophic, and the way that arithmetic kept running even after there was nothing left to calculate. You couldn't have known about the second shooter, he said. I know. The security assessment failed. Your security team failed. That's not your... I know that too. She exhaled. Knowing it and living with it are different problems. He let that sit. Because she was right. Your daughter is okay, he said finally. Charlotte looked at him. Because of you. Because of both of us. He meant it. He'd watched the footage by then. Emily had found it on her tablet and been watching it before he could stop her, and he'd ended up watching it with her, which had been its own particular experience. He remembered seeing, clearly, the moment Charlotte had pulled Lily behind the podium, had put herself between her daughter and the room, had stayed down and kept the girl flat when every instinct probably said to run. You kept her down. You covered her. You stayed. You did more. I was closer. She looked at him for a long moment. You're very difficult to give credit to. So I've been told. Something shifted between them. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the small recalibration that happens when two people who have been on opposite sides of a debt start to find a different way of accounting for things. It was subtle enough that neither of them named it. I want to do something, Charlotte said. For you, for Emily. She held up a hand before he could speak. I'm not trying to pay you off. I'm not trying to... I know that's what this might look like, and I know you're going to tell me you don't need anything, and I'm asking you to hear me out before you say that. He was, in fact, going to say exactly that. He closed his mouth. Your medical costs are being covered, she said. That's already done, and it's not up for discussion because I'm not going to let you argue about it, and you don't have the energy for it anyway. A pause. Emily needs somewhere to stay while you're here. She's been sleeping in waiting rooms and Mrs. Kowalski's guest room, and that's not... She's 8, She needs a bed and a routine, and she needs to not be spending her week in a hospital corridor. Ethan said nothing. I have a house, Charlotte said. It's a large house, which is something I've never been entirely comfortable with, but right now it means there's a room for Emily that isn't a waiting area. Lily is there. When we brought Lily down here yesterday and she met Emily, they spent 45 minutes doing something with paper and stickers that I couldn't follow, but that Lily called extremely important. A pause. My daughter hasn't laughed since the gala. She laughed yesterday. He looked at the window. Outside, the sky was doing something gray and non-committal. He thought about Emily sleeping in a chair. Emily in her school clothes at 9 in the evening because she hadn't had anywhere to go home to change. Emily, with her untied sneaker and her deli sandwich and her direct questions aimed at a CEO, like she was conducting an interview she'd been assigned. How long? He asked. However long you're here, Charlotte said it steadily. No strings, no expectations. Emily comes to see you every day. She sleeps somewhere that has a bed. She has someone to talk to besides a nurse and a 64-year-old woman who falls asleep before 9. He was quiet for a long moment. The monitor beeped. His left side offered its usual opinion. She'll tell you what she thinks about everything, he said finally. She doesn't hold back. I noticed. She rearranges things. She'll move things in your house and then explain logically why her arrangement is better. That's fine. She has a rock collection. It's not small. Charlotte looked like she was suppressing something. I'll find her some shelf space. He looked at the ceiling, then at her. You'd need to check with Emily, he said. It has to be her decision. Of course. He looked at the door. She's probably in the hallway. Charlotte blinked. Right now? She doesn't go far. Charlotte looked at the door. Then she stood, crossed to it, and opened it. There was a brief, muffled exchange that Ethan couldn't fully hear from his bed. Emily's voice, Charlotte's, something that might have been a question, an answer, another question. Then a pause. Then the sound of the door opening wider. Emily came back in first, went immediately to her position on the edge of his bed, and looked at him with the expression she used when she'd made a decision and wanted him to know it was final. She said there's a cat, Emily said. Ethan looked at Charlotte, who was standing in the doorway looking faintly caught. There's a cat, Charlotte confirmed. His name is Archie. He's very old and not very friendly. Emily appeared to find this entirely satisfactory. Okay, she said. I'll go. Ethan looked at his daughter. This small, determined person who had showed up at a hospital by threatening an elderly neighbor with a hypothetical cab, who had fed a stranger from her deli bag without being asked, who had apparently negotiated terms of temporary housing in under 2 minutes in a hallway. He looked at Charlotte, who was watching Emily with an expression that suggested she was recalibrating something. Thank you, he said. Charlotte looked at him. Don't thank me. She said it quietly, without drama. This is the smallest possible thing. He held her gaze. Still, he said. She looked like she was going to argue with that, then decided against it. She nodded once and stepped back from the doorway. Emily was already reorganizing the items on his tray table into a more logical arrangement. Your remote was on the wrong side, she explained. I can see that. Left hand is closer to the bed rail. It should be on the right. She set the remote on the right side. Then she looked at him with the careful measuring look she'd developed sometime in the past 2 years. The one that was Rachel's look, was the look Rachel had used when she was about to say something honest. She's trying to help, Emily said. I know. That's allowed. He looked at her. I know that too. Emily nodded, apparently satisfied. She opened his sandwich packaging for him because his left arm was still limited and set it on the tray with the methodical care of someone performing a task they've decided is important. Outside in the hallway, the floral ecosystem continued to expand. The news vans multiplied. Somewhere across the city, in a large house Ethan had never seen, an unfriendly old cat named Archie was about to have his domestic arrangements permanently disrupted by an 8-year-old with a rock collection and strong opinions about furniture placement. Ethan picked up the coffee Charlotte had left and drank it. It had gone slightly cold. It was still the best coffee he'd had in a week, which was a detail he wasn't going to read anything into. He was just going to let things be what they were. For now, that seemed like enough. Ethan was discharged on a Thursday morning, 17 days after he'd been brought in. Dr. Mehta went through the discharge instructions with the thoroughness of a man who had learned from experience that patients stopped listening after the first 3 bullet points, and so front-loaded the critical information. No heavy lifting for 8 weeks. Physical therapy starting next week, 3 sessions, non-negotiable. The lung had re-expanded cleanly, but it needed time, and he was not, under any circumstances, to treat feeling better as evidence that he was better. He would have follow-up appointments. He would take the medications as prescribed. He would call the number on the discharge sheet if anything changed. Ethan said yes to all of it, which Dr. Mehta received with visible skepticism. "You have the look of a man who will decide he's recovered in 3 weeks," Dr. Mehta said, clicking his pen. "I'll follow the protocol." The look is still there. Emily standing beside the bed with Ethan's discharge bag already packed and organized in the specific way she organized everything, by category, by frequency of use, most needed items on top, looked at Dr. Mehta with the expression of a person who appreciated having an ally. "I'll make sure he does," she said. Dr. Mehta looked at her. "How old are you?" 8? "You seem older." Emily accepted this as simple fact. "I know." The discharge process took longer than it should have, which Ethan suspected had something to do with the 2 hospital administrators who kept appearing in the doorway with paperwork and apologies and the information that some members of the media had gathered in the main lobby, which meant they would be using the east exit, which meant a slightly longer route through a service corridor, which meant, and this was delivered with diplomatic care, that it might be easier if he used a wheelchair for that portion. He did not want to use a wheelchair. Emily looked at him. He got in the wheelchair. Charlotte was waiting at the east exit with a black SUV and a driver and an expression that suggested she'd been there for at least an hour. She was wearing a gray coat and had her hair back, and she looked less like she hadn't been sleeping, which was progress. She looked at the wheelchair, then at Ethan, and managed not to say anything about it, which he appreciated. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like I'm allowed to leave," he said, which was not an answer to the question, but was the best he had. The drive to Charlotte's house took 40 minutes in Baltimore traffic, which gave Ethan enough time to register that he was doing something he hadn't quite fully agreed to yet. He had agreed to Emily staying at Charlotte's during his hospitalization. He had not explicitly agreed to going there himself upon discharge. Somehow, in the logistics of the past week, the discharge planning conversations, the quiet coordination that Charlotte did efficiently and without drawing attention to it, it had become the assumed next step, and he had not objected to the assumption in time, and now he was in an SUV heading somewhere that wasn't his apartment. He thought about his apartment. His landlord had called twice. His supervisor at Vector had called 3 times, each message increasingly gentle and increasingly clear that Ethan's position was held and his back pay was covered, and he should not worry about anything, which was the kind of message that raised more questions than it answered. His 2 work boots were still next to the door where he'd left them the evening of the gala. Charlotte's house was in Roland Park, which was the kind of neighborhood where the trees were old enough to arch over the streets, and the houses had actual yards, and the whole thing looked like someone's idea of what a city could be if it tried a little harder. The house itself was large in the understated way of old money. Not ostentatious, just solid, the kind of construction that assumed it would still be standing in 100 years, and saw no reason to make a fuss about it. Emily had been staying here for 11 days. Ethan had been getting her reports. The reports had included, the cat was named Archie and was extremely old and slept on a specific chair in the library and hissed if you approached from the left side, but was okay if you came from the right, which Emily had figured out on day 2. Charlotte's housekeeper was a woman named Marta, who made very good soup and called Emily Pequeña and had taught her 3 words in Spanish. Lily's room had glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. Lily herself had been, according to Emily's assessment, quiet but getting better, and they had been engaged in an ongoing project involving a map of the world and small colored pins that meant something Emily had explained at length, and Ethan had followed approximately 60% of. What the reports had not included, because Emily was 8 and therefore processed the emotional texture of situations differently than she cataloged their logistical facts, was the thing Ethan noticed when he walked through the front door. His daughter had settled somewhere, not in the permanent sense, not in the sense of forgetting home or forgetting their apartment or forgetting anything, but settled in the way that children settle when they've been given enough stability to stop bracing for the next disruption. She moved through the house without hesitation. She knew where the glasses were. She said hi to Marta by name, and Marta's response had the warmth of repetition, of a greeting that had been given and returned enough times to develop its own small ritual. It knocked something loose in him that he hadn't expected. He stood in the front hallway holding his discharge bag while Charlotte took his coat, and Emily immediately disappeared toward the kitchen, announcing that she was going to get him water because the doctor said hydration was important, and he had not been drinking enough water in the hospital, and he stood there a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "You okay?" Charlotte asked. "Yeah." He wasn't entirely, but it wasn't a medical thing. "Nice house." She looked at him like she suspected this wasn't what he was actually thinking. She was right, but she didn't push it. She'd set up the ground floor study as a room for him, which was practical. He couldn't do stairs reliably yet with the left side still limiting his range, and had done so with the specific thoughtfulness of someone who had actually considered what a person recovering from a gunshot wound needed, rather than what looked hospitable. The bed was positioned so he could get in and out from the right without twisting. There was a table at the right height for the medications. There was no decorative clutter that would require management. The room was quiet, which was the most important thing. He sat on the bed and looked at the room and thought about his apartment, where everything was slightly wrong in ways he'd stopped noticing because they'd been wrong for so long. The secondhand couch that was too soft, the kitchen light that buzzed, the bathroom door that didn't quite close all the way. He wasn't going to think about comparisons. That was a road that didn't lead anywhere useful. Lily appeared in the doorway sometime around noon. She was smaller than he remembered, which made sense because the last time he'd seen her, she'd been in his arms on a stage, and he'd been going into shock. So his memory of her had the distorted quality of everything from that period. In daylight, in jeans and a yellow sweater, she was just a child. Dark-haired like her mother, serious-faced, with gray eyes that he did remember accurately because he'd been looking at them at the end. She stood in the doorway and didn't come in, and he didn't make a move to make it easier or harder. He just waited. "Hi," she said. "Hi." She looked at him with the careful attention of a kid performing her own version of an assessment. "Does it still hurt?" "Some." "Where?" "Left side mostly." She considered this. She was holding something, a folded piece of paper, he realized, that she was handling with the anxious repetition of someone who had been holding it for a while and couldn't decide what to do with it. She noticed him noticing and looked down at it. "I made you something," she said, "in the hospital, when we came to visit." A pause. "Mom said I could leave it with the nurse, but then I decided I wanted to give it to you myself. But then you were always asleep when we came." She unfolded the paper. "It's not very good." It was a drawing. Crayon on folded notebook paper. The proportions entirely childlike, and the color choices ambitious. A large figure with dark hair lying down, a small figure beside him. Above both figures, in careful second-grade handwriting, "Thank you for saving me." From Lily. He looked at it for a moment. "Can I keep it?" he asked. She looked up. "I made it for you." "Right." He folded it back carefully and set it on the table beside his medications. "I'm going to put that somewhere safe." Lily shifted her weight from one foot to the other. She had the look of someone who had prepared something to say and was now deciding whether to say it. "Were you scared?" she asked. "On the stage?" He thought about it honestly. "A little bit, after." "Not during." "During, I was busy." She seemed to find this interesting. "My mom said you used to be in the Navy." "That's right." "Did you do stuff like that a lot? In the Navy?" "Different stuff, same idea." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't say thank you. On the stage." She said it with the specific weight of a child who had been thinking about this for 17 days. "I didn't say anything. I was crying and I couldn't." "You don't need to apologize for that," he said. "I know. Mom said that too." She looked at the drawing on his table. "But I wanted to say it anyway, thank you." He looked at this 8-year-old girl who had been the reason for everything, and who was standing in his borrowed doorway doing the hard work of saying something difficult because she'd decided it needed saying. "You're welcome," he said. Straightforward, no minimizing, no deflection, just the answer. She nodded. Then she said, with the abruptness of children who have completed one task and moved to the next, "Emily says you like chess." "I do." "I'm learning. I'm not very good yet." "I'm not great either." She looked at him like she suspected this was a polite lie, but wasn't sure how to verify it. "Maybe later," she said. "Sure." She went. He heard her footsteps on the stairs, then the distant sound of her and Emily resuming something. Voices. The particular energetic cadence of two kids in the middle of a project. He sat with the drawing on the table beside him, and the afternoon light coming through the window, and the very specific silence of a house that was actually inhabited. He picked up his phone. He needed to call his landlord back. He needed to call his supervisor. He needed to call Marcus Webb, who had been his closest friend from his SEAL team, and who had sent 7 texts since the shooting that Ethan had not yet answered, each one a different variation of the same thing. "You good? Just say yes or no, I don't need details." He typed, "Yes." Marcus responded in under a minute. "You're going to hate every second of recovery. Call me when you're bored." He put the phone down and closed his eyes, and for the first time in 17 days, fell asleep without the monitor beeping. The first time Charlotte came to him with the offer, Ethan said no. She came on a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks after he'd arrived at the house. He was on the back porch, which was where he'd been spending most of his mornings. The physical therapist had cleared him for short walks, and the yard was flat and private, and he liked the quality of air outside better than inside, which was a preference he hadn't known he had until he'd been deprived of it for 2.5 weeks. He had a coffee and a copy of a logistics management textbook he'd been working through before the gala, which was not interesting reading, but was the kind of thing he thought he should know more about if he was going to stay in the facility's maintenance field long term. Charlotte came out with her own coffee and sat in the other porch chair and looked at the textbook. "Logistics management? I'm trying to pass a certification." "For vector?" "For options." He looked at her. "What's on your mind?" She'd been building to something for the past few days. He could tell. Not from any obvious signal, but from the quality of her attention when they talked, the way she was thinking through how to say something while she was saying other things. She was not someone who spoke carelessly, and she was not someone who surprised easily, which made her preparation visible if you were watching for it. She told him. She wanted him to come on as Director of Executive Security for Kensington Dynamics. She outlined the role. Restructuring the security division, implementing new protocols, overseeing the threat assessment program that had so badly failed in November. She told him the salary, which was a number that required him to keep his expression very still. She told him the benefits. She told him about Emily's school options and the adjustability of his schedule. She told him she had already consulted with 3 people whose judgment she trusted, and all 3 had said he was the right person for this. She said all of it well, clearly, thoroughly, without making it feel like charity, which he appreciated because it would have been easy to make it feel like charity, and she had deliberately chosen not to. He said no. Not immediately. He let her finish. Then he sat with it for a moment, the coffee warm in his hands, the yard quiet, and he said, "I appreciate this. I mean that. But I'm not the right fit." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because I'm a maintenance tech, not an executive." "You were a Navy SEAL. That was 3 years ago." "Ethan." She said his name with the weight of someone who had been working up to this conversation and wasn't going to let it get redirected by modesty. "I've read your service record. I know what you did. I know the operations you ran and the people you were responsible for and the decisions you made in situations where wrong decisions meant people died. I'm asking you to transfer that skill set to a corporate environment. Those are not the same thing, but you are more qualified than you're giving yourself credit for, and you know it." He looked at the yard. A squirrel was doing something assertive near the fence line. "Your people won't respect it." "My people will respect results. I don't have a business background. I have people who have business backgrounds. I need someone who has something different." She paused. The security team that was in place the night of the gala, they had certifications. They had protocols. They had everything on paper, and they missed 2 trained gunmen who had been scoping the venue for 3 days. She held his gaze. I don't need someone with the right credentials. I need someone with the right instincts. He was quiet for a moment. He recognized the argument because it was a good argument, and he recognized that he was sitting in her porch chair drinking her coffee while his daughter played inside her house, and her daughter, who was alive because of him, was upstairs doing homework. And he recognized that all of that was true simultaneously, and that none of it changed the fundamental fact he kept arriving at. I didn't do what I did at the gala for a job, he said. I know that. I need you to know that's not why I'm saying no either. I'm not holding out for better terms. I'm saying no because I think I'm the wrong person. You're wrong about being the wrong person. Maybe. He set down the coffee. But I need to be sure I'm doing this for the right reasons. Not because I feel like I owe you something. Not because it's the easiest next step. Not because... He stopped. Rachel used to say that I made my best decisions when I wasn't in a hurry. I'm still in a hurry, in here. He touched his chest, slightly to the right of the wound. I need a little more time. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. He thought she was going to push. She was the kind of person who was accustomed to pushing effectively, who had built a company from a seed round by knowing exactly when to apply pressure and when to wait, and he thought she was going to choose pressure. She chose to wait. Okay, she said. Tell me when you're ready. He nodded. She picked up her coffee. They sat on the porch in the thin December afternoon, and neither of them said anything for a while, and it was not uncomfortable. He changed his mind on a Tuesday. He hadn't planned to. He'd been working through the decision the way he worked through everything, methodically, without forcing it, letting the information arrange itself rather than trying to arrange it. And on a Tuesday evening in December, he was sitting on the floor of the upstairs hallway because Emily had asked him to come look at the map project she and Lily had been building. And he'd managed the stairs slowly with the left side still negotiating its terms. And he sat on the floor because sitting on the floor was easier than getting up and down from chairs. The map covered most of one wall of Lily's room. It was a large printed world map with hundreds of small colored pins in it. And beside the map was a hand-lettered key on poster board that both girls had clearly worked on together, the handwriting alternating between Emily's careful block letters and Lily's rounder print. The pins corresponded to veteran families. Ethan had understood this from Emily's earlier reports, but hadn't understood the scale until he was sitting on the floor looking at it. Where did you get all these? He asked. Mom has a database, Lily said. From the Foundation research, she let us use the numbers. There are 412 pins, Emily said. As of this morning, we've been adding them. 412 pins, 412 families. And that was just the subset Charlotte's Foundation research had identified, which was a subset of something much larger. He looked at the map for a long time. Dad? Emily said. She was watching him. Yeah. Are you okay? He looked at his daughter. She was sitting cross-legged beside him on the floor, close enough that her shoulder was against his arm, and she was watching him with the careful attention she'd developed over the past 2 years. The watch that meant she was tracking something in him that she didn't have words for yet, but had learned to notice. He thought about what he'd told Charlotte. I need to be sure I'm doing it for the right reasons. He looked at the map. He looked at his daughter. He looked at Lily, who was watching him too, with her gray eyes and her quiet seriousness. 412 pins, families, kids who were Emily's age or younger, fathers who were doing what he'd been doing, maintenance shifts and secondhand furniture and careful arithmetic about what they could afford that month, because they'd come back from something and hadn't found a way through to the other side. He'd been lucky in the specific sense that he'd had skills people noticed. Most of them didn't have that. Most of them had the same history and the same quiet competence and the same complete absence of anyone who knew to look for it. Lily, he said. She looked at him. Does your mom know where her office is right now? Lily blinked. Probably her study. She's usually there on Tuesday nights. He started the careful process of getting up from the floor, which involved his right side doing most of the work and his jaw doing the rest. Dad, you're not supposed to... Emily started. I'm fine. That's always what you say before you make a face. I'm mostly fine. He got vertical. He looked at both of them. "I'll be back." Charlotte's study was on the second floor, which meant stairs again, which he negotiated at the pace of someone who had internalized that being stubborn about this particular metric of recovery was genuinely stupid. He knocked on the open door. She was at her desk with reading glasses he hadn't seen her wear before and a stack of documents and the focused inward stillness of someone deep in something. She looked up. "I'll do it," he said. She took off the reading glasses. What changed? He thought about the map, about the pins, about the specific thing that happened when you spent 3 years being quietly competent in a maintenance uniform and nobody saw the former person inside it until a gunshot made it visible. "The foundation," he said, "the one you mentioned, for veteran families." She was still. If that's actually going to be built, not just announced, then I'll take the security job." He paused. "But I want to be involved in building it, not as a figurehead, actually involved." Charlotte set down her pen. "You'd want input on structure, programming? I'd want to know that it's designed by people who understand what these families actually need, not what looks good in a press release." He met her eyes. "I've been one of them. I know what the gap looks like from the inside." She was quiet for a moment. The desk lamp made a warm pool of light. Outside it was raining, a thin December rain that tapped against the window. "I want that too," she said. "That's exactly what I want." She paused. "I've been trying to build this program for 2 years and I keep running into the same wall. We have resources and we have people who are good at deploying resources, but we don't have anyone who actually knows what these families experience. You need someone who's been it." "Yes." He looked at the rain on the window. He thought about what Rachel would say about this. He knew what she'd say. He knew the exact cadence of it, the particular way she had of making the obvious thing sound like an adventure rather than a decision. "Ethan, stop overthinking. Just do the thing." He wasn't overthinking anymore. "Okay," he said. Charlotte looked at him. "Okay?" "Yeah." She leaned back in her chair and looked at him with the expression of someone who had been holding a breath for a while and was now releasing it carefully. "You're sure?" "I'll need time to recover before I can actually do the job properly. We'll build in a transition period. I'll have opinions. I'll push back when I think something's wrong." "Good. My priority is Emily. That will never be a problem here." She said it directly and without sentiment, which was the only way he'd have believed it. He nodded. He looked at the door, then back at her. "I should tell you something," he said. She waited. "When I ran across that ballroom, I wasn't thinking about being a hero. I wasn't thinking about sacrifice or what it meant or what might happen." He paused. "I was thinking about Emily, about what it would look like from the outside if I saw something bad happening to her, and I walked away because it was safer." He held Charlotte's gaze. "I would never be able to explain that to her, so I couldn't do it." Charlotte looked at him for a long time. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm not telling you that to be modest. I'm telling you because I think you should know what kind of person you're hiring." He paused. "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who knew what they couldn't live with." Charlotte set her elbows on the desk and looked at him with the unguarded directness he'd noticed was her actual register when she wasn't managing a room. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think that's exactly the right reason." He let that sit. Then he said, "The announcement, when you go public with the offer." "What about it?" "I want to talk about veterans, not about the ballroom, not about what I did." He met her eyes. "If I'm going to stand in front of people and say something, it's going to be about the 412 pins, not about me." Charlotte held his gaze. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. That is exactly what a person who should be in this role would say. He didn't have an answer for that. He looked at the rain on the window. He thought about his apartment in southwest Baltimore, the buzzing kitchen light and the bathroom door that didn't close, and about his former life that was now the before half of something whose after half he couldn't entirely see yet. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. Scared was part of it. Relieved was another part. The specific exhaustion of having been stationary so long and now being in motion again was part of it too. But underneath all of that was something steadier. The same thing he'd found on the floor of Lily's room, looking at 412 pins on a wall map. The thing that felt, for the first time in 3 years, like a reason that was bigger than just getting to the next day. He went back downstairs, carefully, one step at a time, his left side registering every single one, and came back to the hallway outside Lily's room, where both girls were still on the floor in front of the map, engaged in what appeared to be a detailed discussion about where to add the next pin. Emily looked up when he sat down beside her. "Well?" she said. "I said yes." She looked at him for a moment, then she looked at the map, then she handed him a pin. "Green means housing support," she said. "Blue means employment, red means childcare." She paused. "We're running low on green." He looked at the pin in his hand, then at the map, then at his daughter, who had apparently decided that the administrative details of a veterans foundation were within the scope of her current concerns. "Okay," he said. He put the pin on the map. Emily gave a small, satisfied nod. Lily watched him with her gray eyes and said nothing, but she slid a little closer to her side of the map, making room. Outside, the rain came down. Inside, the house held its quiet around them. The three of them on the floor, the map covered in colored pins, the whole improbable shape of what had been set in motion by one split-second decision in a ballroom that none of them would ever entirely leave behind. He looked at the map for a while, at all those pins, at all those families, and he sat with the weight of what he'd just agreed to, and it was heavy, and it was exactly right. The press conference was Charlotte's idea, and Ethan's least favorite part of the entire arrangement. It happened on a Thursday in January, 6 weeks after the gala, in the main conference room at Kensington Dynamics headquarters, which was a glass and steel building in downtown Baltimore that Ethan had driven past 100 times without ever thinking about the inside of it. The communications team had spent 3 days preparing materials. There were talking points. There were drafted statements. There was a very organized woman named Priya who worked in Charlotte's PR department and who had come to the house twice that week to walk Ethan through what to expect, which he had sat through with the patience of a man attending a briefing about a mission he already understood and would execute differently in the field regardless. "The key is to stay on message," Priya had said on her second visit, tapping her tablet with a stylus. "We want the narrative centered on the foundation, not on the incident. We acknowledge your background, we acknowledge your bravery, and we pivot to the forward-looking story." "Pivot," Ethan had said. "Yes, it's about transition, from the event to the mission." "Right." She'd looked at him over her tablet. "Mr. Brooks, I want to be honest with you. The media is going to ask about the shooting, multiple times, from multiple angles. They're going to ask how it felt, what you were thinking, whether you consider yourself a hero. We've prepared responses that—" "I'll answer the questions," he'd said. Priya had paused. "Our prepared responses are designed to—" "I understand that. I'm going to answer the questions myself." She'd looked at Charlotte, who was sitting across the table from Ethan with her coffee and the specific expression she wore when she had already determined that a situation was going to unfold a particular way and had made her peace with it. Charlotte had given Priya a small nod that communicated without words that this was one of those hills she had personally chosen not to die on. Priya had clicked her stylus once and moved on. The conference room was full by the time they walked in. Local press, 2 national outlets, a photographer from the Associated Press who sat up directly to Charlotte's left and spent the first 5 minutes doing test shots that Ethan tried not to track. Charlotte took the podium first, which was right. It was her company, her stage, her foundation. She spoke clearly and precisely about the Kensington Dynamics Veteran Family Initiative, about the structure and the funding and the timeline, about the partnerships they'd already committed to with 3 veteran-focused nonprofits in the Maryland and Virginia area. She was good at this. He'd known that from the gala, but watching her work a press conference was a different register of it. She knew when to slow down for emphasis, when to accelerate through technical detail, when to make eye contact with a specific camera. She'd built something from nothing, twice over, and she knew how to explain why it mattered without making it sound like the explanation was the point. Then she introduced him, and the room changed. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was the particular charge that fills a space when everyone in it has already seen something about a person, on a screen, in a headline. in the particular compressed loop of footage that had been played enough times to become a kind of collective memory, and is now recalibrating against the actual human standing in front of them. He felt it. He'd felt it in enough operations briefings to know what a room recalibrating felt like. He stepped to the podium. He looked at the room. He put aside the prepared remarks Priya had sent him at 11 o'clock last night, which he had read twice and then set aside because they were fine and also not the thing he was going to say. "I'm not going to talk much about the night of the gala," he said. "If you've got questions about it, I'll answer them, but I'm not going to lead with it, because I don't think that's what's important here." He paused. "What's important is this. There are approximately 1.9 million veteran households in the United States that include dependent children. About a third of those families live at or near the poverty line. Single-parent veteran households, which is what I am, have a significantly higher rate of housing instability, food insecurity, and mental health crisis than comparable civilian households. Most of these families are not visible. They don't show up in the statistics that get attention. They don't end up on the news." Another pause. "I was one of them. For 3 years, I was one of them, and the only reason anyone knows my name today is because of something that happened in a ballroom that I would have done regardless of who was watching, and that I don't want to spend the next chapter of my life explaining. The room was quiet, in the way rooms go quiet when people are listening rather than waiting for their turn. These families don't need a narrative," he said. "They need housing. They need childcare they can actually afford. They need employers who understand that a veteran's resume doesn't always look like a civilian's resume, but contains skills most hiring managers can't even identify, let alone assess. They need someone to tell them that what they did, the service, the sacrifice, the years of not being home, was not supposed to leave them on the other side of it alone." He stopped. He looked at the room. "That's the foundation. That's what this is for. I'm involved because I know what the gap looks like from the inside, and because Ms. Kensington asked, and because I couldn't find a good reason to say no." He stepped back from the podium. There was a beat of silence, and then the questions started, and most of them were exactly what Priya had predicted. He answered them steadily, without performance. When a reporter from one of the national outlets asked if he considered himself a hero, he said, "No. I consider myself a former service member who made a fast decision in a bad situation. Heroes are people who do something difficult repeatedly, without recognition, over a long period of time. Go find one of those families I just mentioned and talk to the parent. That's your hero." The reporter looked slightly unsatisfied with this answer, which Ethan was fine with. When another reporter asked what he would say to the gunman who had been arrested, he said, "Nothing. I don't have anything to say to them." When someone near the back asked what it felt like to wake up in the hospital and realize he'd survived, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "My daughter was holding my hand. That's what I remember." There were no more questions after that. Afterward, in the hallway, Priya found him with the expression of someone who had expected a controlled burn and gotten something slightly different. "That was not the messaging we prepared," she said. "I know. It was also—" She stopped, restarted. "It was effective. It was very effective. I just want to flag that for future reference." "What's the flag?" "The flag is that when you go off script, I can't predict outcomes." He looked at her. "When I went off script in the field, the outcomes were generally better than the plan." Priya looked at him for a moment. Then she clicked her stylus, turned, and walked back toward the conference room. He thought he heard something that might have been a suppressed laugh, but he couldn't confirm it. Charlotte appeared at his shoulder. "Well," she said, "was that okay? The AP photographer got a shot of you at the podium that's going to be on the front page of 3 papers tomorrow." She paused. "And our foundation donations page has been refreshing approximately every 4 seconds since the live stream ended. So yes, it was okay." He looked at the floor. "I didn't do it for that." "I know," she said. "That's why it worked." They walked out of the building together into the January cold, which was sharp and honest in the way of Baltimore January. No pretense about it. He started at Kensington Dynamics the following Monday. It was harder than he'd expected, not because the work was beyond him, but because the work was new in the specific way that made his competence temporarily invisible, which was a condition Ethan found deeply uncomfortable. He'd been doing what he did well for long enough that the experience of doing something poorly, even temporarily, even because of the learning curve, felt like a more personal indictment than it was. The security team he inherited was 9 people, mixed in background, 2 former military, 3 with law enforcement experience, 4 who had come up through private corporate security firms, and had the particular skill set of people who had spent careers managing access control and executive travel logistics. They were professional, and they were cautious, and they were individually capable. As a team, they had the structural problem of a department that had been designed to look reassuring on paper without being asked to actually function under real operational pressure. He restructured it in 8 weeks. Not loudly. He'd seen enough bad leadership to know that the noisy version, the one where the new guy comes in and immediately establishes that everything before him was wrong, was both usually inaccurate and always counterproductive. He spent the first 2 weeks watching. He sat in on their briefings. He reviewed their protocols. He asked questions that were specific enough to communicate that he'd done his reading and open-ended enough to communicate that he was genuinely asking, not testing. He found good things. Marcus Reed, one of the former military hires, Army, 2 tours in Afghanistan, had developed an internal threat assessment framework that was significantly more sophisticated than anything in their official documentation, but that nobody had formalized or trained to because nobody above him had recognized what it was. Ethan took it, worked with Marcus to build it out properly, and made it the operational foundation of the new protocol. Marcus had the expression, for about 3 days afterward, of someone who had been doing a thing for 2 years and was still adjusting to having it seen. He found problems. The access control system for the executive floor had 3 known vulnerabilities that had been flagged in an internal audit 14 months ago and never addressed because the remediation cost had been deferred twice. He walked Charlotte through the specifics on a Wednesday evening in her office, on the ground floor of the building, which he'd taken as his base of operations because it was closer to the entry points, and he didn't like working from the interior. She looked at the audit document. "I knew about this," she said. "I know. Your CFO approved both deferrals." She set down the document. "What do I need to authorize?" He told her. She authorized it by the end of the meeting, which he noted and filed away. She was not a person who let the space between understanding a problem and acting on it get larger than necessary. The other significant problem was cultural. The security team's relationship with the executive staff had the particular dysfunction of a group that had been arranged to serve as backdrop rather than as operational colleagues. The executives didn't think in terms of security logic. The security staff had largely stopped trying to make them. The result was a gap between threat awareness and behavior that was, in Ethan's assessment, the actual reason the gala had been catastrophically mismanaged. Not the presence of 2 trained shooters, but the absence of anyone in the room who had authority and situational awareness simultaneously. He fixed this slowly, which was the only way to fix it. He ran exercises. He made the executive assistants part of the threat protocol, because executive assistants knew the schedule and the anomalies and the small deviations that didn't look like anything from the outside but looked like something from the inside, if you knew what to look for. He spent an afternoon with Charlotte's assistant, a brisk woman named Diane, who had been with the company for 11 years and had opinions she'd stopped volunteering, and emerged from that conversation with more operational intelligence about Charlotte's daily security gaps than he'd gotten from any formal briefing. "You're the first person who's asked me any of this," Diane told him. "That's a problem I'm fixing," he said. Diane looked at him with the measured approval of someone who had been waiting a long time for someone to ask. "Good," she said. The foundation work ran in parallel, which meant his weeks were structured in a way that left very little empty space. He was at the office by 7:30 most mornings, home by 6:30 most evenings, which was better than Vector had been, but was still a math problem he thought about. The hours Emily was in school versus the hours he was working versus the hours that were actually theirs. Emily was back in her own school, back in their own apartment, which Ethan had returned to in January with the determination to make it work and the practical acknowledgement that it had some significant deficiencies he was now, for the first time, in a position to address. He'd fixed the kitchen light himself, 15 minutes, a replacement bulb driver, done, and had a building maintenance guy come look at the bathroom door, which turned out to be a warped frame that needed shimming. He bought a new couch, not an extravagant couch, just a functional one that didn't actively work against the people sitting on it. Emily had watched him move the old couch to the hallway with the expression of someone revisiting a long-held grievance. "I said that couch was bad 2 years ago," she told him. "You were 6. I was still right." "You were right," he agreed. She had gone back to school and back to her routines with the adaptability that children have when their fundamental center is stable. The routines changed, but the center held, and her fundamental center was Ethan, and Ethan was present and functional, and increasingly less likely to make the face that indicated he was pretending his left side wasn't bothering him. She'd been visiting Lily twice a week, which had started as Charlotte facilitating and had evolved into something the two girls arranged between themselves via a shared messaging app that Lily had lobbied for, and that Ethan had agreed to with the specific parental understanding that he had access to the thread and would be reading it. He read it. It was almost entirely about the World Map Project, which had expanded to include a detailed spreadsheet system that Lily had apparently designed and Emily had apparently stress-tested and found wanting in 3 specific ways that she had noted in a separate document. He did not intervene. He did tell Emily that he was proud of her, which she received with her characteristic combination of genuine pleasure and mild embarrassment. Charlotte came to the apartment once, in February, to drop Lily off for what had become their standard Saturday afternoon arrangement. The girls did their project, Ethan made dinner, Lily went home at 7. She stood in the doorway and looked around with the carefully neutral expression of someone who was not going to comment on the size of the space. "You fixed the couch," she said. He looked at her. "Emily told you about the couch." "Emily tells me a lot of things." "I know." He stepped back from the door. "You want coffee?" She came in. She sat at the kitchen table while he made coffee, and she looked at the apartment, at Emily's homework spread across the coffee table, at the rock collection that had been moved to a shelf above the bookcase where the individual specimens were labeled in Emily's handwriting, at the small framed photo of Rachel on the windowsill that he'd had there since the beginning, and that was the first thing he'd unpacked when they'd moved in 3 years ago. Charlotte looked at the photo. She didn't say anything about it. "How's the transition going?" she asked. "At work?" "At work. Here. Generally." He poured the coffee. "The team is coming together. Marcus Reed is the right person to develop the new assessment protocols. He had most of the framework already, he just needed someone to see it." He set the cup in front of her. "The access control remediation is on schedule. I want to do a full external audit in the spring, bring in someone who isn't us to poke holes." "I agree. I'll allocate the budget." "I know." He sat across from her. "You're easy to work for in that way." She looked at him over the coffee cup. "Only in that way?" "I didn't say that." "You implied it." He considered his coffee. "You make decisions fast. Faster than most people who are responsible for the same scale of things. That's good, mostly. Sometimes it means you're past the thinking stage before other people have gotten to it." She was quiet for a moment. "Does that cause problems?" "Not for me. I work fast too, I just notice it." Charlotte looked at her cup. "My ex-husband used to say, I made decisions like I was afraid something would change if I thought too long." He didn't say anything. "He wasn't entirely wrong," she said. Then, "Lily talks about Emily constantly." "Emily talks about Lily constantly." "Lily said Emily reorganized her bookshelf." "Emily reorganizes everything." Lily seemed... Charlotte paused. She didn't mind. She seemed to like it. A beat. "Lily doesn't let most people touch her things. She's particular." "Emily's the same way." He thought about it. "Maybe that's why they work." Charlotte smiled. Not a professional expression, just a real one, the unguarded version she'd been producing more often over the past months in the spaces between the formal things. 2 particular 8-year-olds with a shared project and a world map. She shook her head slightly. "I don't know what I was expecting when I asked if Lily could stay at the hospital." "You were expecting to help." "I was expecting it to be more complicated." "Some of it was." "Some of it," she agreed. He looked at the window. The February light was flat and thin, the kind that didn't commit to anything. Rachel's photo caught the edge of it. He thought about the fact that Charlotte had looked at the photo and said nothing, which was something he appreciated without knowing exactly why. The restraint of it, the understanding that some things in a room were just part of the room and didn't require comment. "The foundation board meeting is next week," Charlotte said. "I know. I'll have the veteran intake assessment draft ready by Thursday." "I'm not worried about the draft." She put down her cup. "I'm worried about you presenting it and then immediately deferring when Harmon starts pushing back." Ethan looked at her. Gerald Harmon was the foundation's CFO, brought in from outside, and was a man with very precise ideas about program cost efficiency that were developed in the absence of any actual contact with the populations the program served. He had pushed back on 2 of Ethan's recommendations in the preliminary meetings with the polished confidence of someone who had been the smartest person in most rooms and had stopped questioning whether that was actually the case. "I'll handle Harmon," Ethan said. "You handled him last time by getting very quiet and then agreeing to table the discussion. I needed more data." "Ethan." Charlotte looked at him directly. "You had the data. You had better data than he did. You just didn't like the confrontation." He was quiet. "I'm not criticizing you," she said. "I'm telling you because I want you to be effective in that room, and you won't be effective if you let Harmon redirect every uncomfortable conversation. You know what these families need. He knows what the balance sheet looks like. Those are both necessary, but you have to be willing to hold your ground." He sat with this for a moment. She wasn't wrong. He was comfortable with physical confrontation in ways that most people weren't, and uncomfortable with a specific kind of institutional argument, the kind where someone used procedural authority and financial language to override operational knowledge, in ways he hadn't fully worked out yet. "I'll be ready," he said. "I know you will." She picked up her coffee. "I just wanted to say it out loud." He looked at her. "You do that. Say the thing out loud when you don't have to. Is that a problem?" "No." He thought about it. Rachel did that too. The name dropped into the conversation and sat there. He'd said it intentionally, which was different from how it had come up before. He wasn't sure exactly why he'd said it. He was sure he didn't regret it. Charlotte looked at him carefully. "She sounds like she was direct." "She was the most direct person I ever knew. It was occasionally infuriating." "Occasionally?" "Often. Frequently?" He looked at the photo. It was one of the best things about her. Charlotte didn't try to fill the space that followed. She just let it be there, the way she'd let things be before. And he was grateful for it in the same wordless way. The board meeting happened on a Wednesday, and Ethan did not get quiet when Harmon pushed back. He waited for Harmon to finish the argument: cost per family ratios, program overhead benchmarks, comparative analysis of similar foundation models. And then he opened his own folder and laid out 12 pages of intake data that his team had collected from their pilot outreach in the first month. Not abstractions, cases. Families with names and situations and specific gaps that the Foundation's proposed programs would address, and that no comparable foundation model had yet addressed, because no comparable foundation model had been designed by someone who had actually lived inside the problem. "This family," Ethan said, pointing to a specific case summary, "is a former Marine, 2 kids ages 5 and 7, evicted in November, currently in transitional housing in Prince George's County. He's been applying for civilian employment for 14 months. He has a security clearance, weapons proficiency, leadership experience running a 12-person unit under combat conditions, and a work history that civilian HR systems consistently flag as incomplete because it doesn't look like a standard resume." He looked up. "He's been rejected by 11 employers, not because he's unqualified, because nobody in those HR departments knows what to do with him." He looked at Harmon. "Our employment pathway program costs $4,200 per family to administer. The cost of that family staying in the transitional housing system for another 6 months is $11,000, not counting the children's educational disruption. Those are the numbers." Harmon looked at the page. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Charlotte, who was sitting at the end of the table with the expression she wore when she was watching something she'd been waiting for. Harmon did not withdraw the objection entirely. That would have required a different kind of person. But he accepted a modified version of the proposal that preserved the essential program structure. And he did it with the slightly deflated composure of someone whose argument had been defeated on its own terms. After the meeting, Marcus Reed, who had come as Ethan's operational second, fell into step beside him in the corridor. "That was different from last month," he said. "I did more prep." Marcus looked at him sideways. "Nah." He shook his head. "You just decided to actually be in the room." Ethan thought about that and didn't argue. By spring, the foundation had completed intake assessments for 63 families and enrolled 31 in active programs. The employment pathway had placed 8 veterans in civilian jobs. Not great jobs in all cases, not perfect fits, but real employment with real income and real benefits. 2 families had moved out of transitional housing. One of them sent a handwritten card that arrived at the Kensington Dynamics mailroom addressed to the Foundation people and made its way to Ethan's desk through a chain of slightly puzzled office staff. He read it. It was from the Marine he'd described to Harmon. It said, "My kids have a bedroom again. I just wanted someone to know that." He put the card in his desk drawer. Not framed, not displayed, just kept. Charlotte found him looking at it one afternoon when she stopped by his office. She stopped by his office a few times a week, usually with a logistical reason that was real enough to serve as cover for what was also just checking in, which he'd identified but not named. She looked at the card in his hand. "Good news?" He handed it to her. She read it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she set it on his desk carefully, the way you set down something that has weight. 31 families, she said. "So far." She looked at him. "You said 412 pins." 417 last count. Emily's been updating the map. Charlotte smiled at that. "We'll get there." He looked at the card on the desk. "My kids have a bedroom again." "Yeah," he said, "we will." Outside the window, Baltimore was doing what it did in March, arguing with itself about whether winter was finished, delivering cold mornings and misleadingly warm afternoons and rain that couldn't decide on a direction. Inside, his office was small and functional, with a whiteboard covered in security protocol diagrams, and a desk that had too much paper on it, and a chair that was slightly too short, which he'd been meaning to adjust for 2 months. He was not managing this perfectly. There were days when the left side reminded him it wasn't done with him. There were evenings when he came home to Emily and felt the specific guilt of a parent who had spent the day doing something that mattered and wasn't sure the accounting added up correctly against the time he hadn't been present for. There were board meetings that were hard. There were conversations with Charlotte that went sideways in ways neither of them had anticipated and had to be untangled carefully afterward. He was not a polished version of himself. He was the regular version, the one that made mistakes in the conference room and over-tightened things when he was stressed, and sometimes forgot to eat lunch until 4 in the afternoon, and still couldn't hear Rachel's name from a stranger's mouth, without a half-second of something that wasn't quite grief anymore, but was related to it. But he was in the room. He was actually in the room now, holding his ground in it, adding something to it. That was what he'd said yes to. Not to being transformed, just to being useful in a way that was bigger than he'd allowed himself to be for 3 years. That distinction mattered to him. He held on to it. He picked up the card, put it back in the drawer, and went to find Marcus to talk about the spring audit. The day was not finished, and there was still work to do. 3 years is long enough for things to stop feeling temporary. Ethan noticed it first in small ways. The way he stopped mentally comparing his office at Kensington Dynamics to the service corridors at Vector. The way Emily's school schedule had become the organizing structure of his week without him having to think about it. The way he knew which coffee place near the building had the shortest line on Tuesday mornings, and which parking structure had the fastest exit, and which of the security team's members needed 30 minutes of quiet before a morning briefing, and which ones needed to talk first. The small calibrations of a life that has settled into its own shape. The foundation had grown in ways that still surprised him sometimes when he looked at the numbers. What had started as a program framework on a whiteboard in Charlotte's study had become an operational organization with a staff of 14, partnerships with nonprofit housing networks in 6 states, an employment pathway program that had placed over 200 veterans in civilian jobs, and a child care subsidy initiative that was, in Ethan's private assessment, the most important thing they'd built because it was the thing nobody else was doing at scale. The child care gap was invisible to most people outside of it. The specific math of a single veteran parent whose shift schedule didn't align with any available subsidy program's eligibility window, who couldn't take the job because the job's hours made the child care impossible, who stayed stuck not because of failure, but because of arithmetic. Ethan had been that math problem. He understood it from the inside. The map in Lily's room had long since been retired in favor of a digital tracking system that the Foundation's program director, a former social worker named Janet Osei, who had the particular talent of caring deeply about people while maintaining the organizational discipline to actually help them, updated in real time. But Emily had kept the original map. She'd brought it home when the girls agreed the physical version had been superseded, and it was now on the wall of her room in the apartment, a little worn at the edges from being handled, the colored pins still in their positions from the last time they'd updated it manually. She never took the pins out. Ethan had asked her about it once. "It's where we started," Emily had said, as if that were sufficient explanation, which, for her, it was. She was 11 now. The gap between her front teeth had closed, just as the dentist had predicted, which Ethan had mixed feelings about because he'd liked it. She was taller. She'd had a growth spurt in the fall that she'd announced to him with statistical precision, having measured herself against the doorframe in her room with a ruler and a pencil mark. She was reading books that were too old for her in the opinion of her teachers and exactly right for her in the opinion of everyone who actually knew her, and she had opinions about things, real opinions, not the opinions of a child performing precocity, but the opinions of a person developing a genuine inner life, that she delivered with the same directness that had always been hers. She had also, over the course of 3 years, become the kind of kid who called Charlotte by her first name. This had happened gradually, the way most of the important things between these two families had happened. Not through any declared decision, but through the slow accumulation of ordinary time spent together until the formality that had never quite fit anyway simply fell away. Charlotte had told Ethan about it the first time Emily had done it, with an expression that was trying to be neutral about something it was not neutral about. "She called me Charlotte," Charlotte had said. "I heard. I didn't correct her. Was that okay?" Charlotte had looked at him. "Yes," she'd said. "It was very okay." Lily was 11 too, and had the quality of a child who was becoming someone specific, not just a child growing up, but a particular person emerging, with preferences and convictions, and a dry humor that had surprised Ethan the first time he'd encountered it, and continued to surprise him because it arrived without warning. She was quieter than Emily, more interior, more likely to think for a long time before she said something, which meant that when she did say something, it tended to land. She had her mother's way of choosing words deliberately. The two girls had been best friends for 3 years, which in the lives of 11-year-olds was essentially their entire remembered existence of each other. They did not have the friendship of children who had been put together by adults and had made the best of it. They had the friendship of children who had found something in each other that they hadn't known they needed. Lily, who had lost her ease after the gala, and had found it back in the straightforward company of a girl who reorganized things and named rocks, and asked hard questions without meanness. Emily, who had been doing the quiet work of not falling apart after her mother died, and had found in Lily someone who didn't make her feel like she had to explain herself. Ethan thought about this sometimes, about what would have happened to both of them in the absence of that terrible night. He tried not to think about it too directly, because it led somewhere uncomfortable, the idea that something catastrophic had been the mechanism for something necessary. He didn't have a clean way to account for that. He just held both things and let them be complicated. The man who had ordered the attack on Charlotte and Lily, whose name was Richard Hale, a former business partner whose IP dispute had curdled into something far darker than commercial grievance, had pled guilty to conspiracy charges in federal court 14 months after the gala. The sentencing had happened on a gray November morning, and Ethan had been there in the back of the courtroom because Charlotte had asked if he would come. And he'd said yes without deliberating because the question had been that simple. He had not felt, watching Hale in the courtroom, what he'd expected to feel. He'd expected something sharp, anger, maybe, or satisfaction, or the particular cold clarity of a concluded thing. What he'd felt instead was tired, just tired, in the way you feel when something that has been using up energy in the background finally stops. Hale was 53 years old and had the slightly diminished look of a man who had made a catastrophic mistake and had been living inside it for over a year, and Ethan had looked at him and thought, This is what it looks like when a person decides that winning a business argument is worth a child's life. He had no framework for it. He didn't try to build one. Charlotte had been steady through the whole proceeding, which he'd expected. She'd made a victim impact statement that she'd written herself and read without notes, and that was 12 sentences long and contained nothing that would give Hale anything back. No rage, no grief performed for the room, just the clean accounting of what had been done and what it had cost. He'd watched her from 3 rows back and thought, she is one of the most disciplined people I've ever known. And discipline like that always costs something, and she's been paying the cost for 3 years without letting it show. Afterward, in the courthouse parking structure, she'd sat in the passenger seat of his car for a while without saying anything. He didn't try to fill it. He'd learned over 3 years that her silences were working silences. She was doing something in them, processing, assembling, arriving somewhere. "It doesn't feel like I thought it would," she said finally. "No. I thought I'd feel like it was over." "It is over." "I know that." She looked at the concrete wall of the parking structure. "I just thought I'd feel it more." He thought about what to say. He'd learned, also over 3 years, that she didn't need him to fix things she was processing. She needed him to be in the room while she processed them. That was a specific skill that he'd had to develop consciously, because his instinct was always toward action, toward solution, toward the thing he could do. Sitting with someone while they found their own way to something was harder for him than it should have been. "It's done," he said. "He's gone. Lily is safe. You're safe." He paused. "The rest of it, the feeling part, takes as long as it takes." Charlotte turned and looked at him. She'd been doing that more over the past year, looking at him directly without the professional register, without the management layer. It had taken a long time for that layer to come down, and he understood why it had taken that long because he had his own version of the same thing, a different architecture, but the same function. "I know," she said. "Thank you for being here today." "Of course." She was quiet for another moment, then, "Can we get food? I haven't eaten since 6 this morning, and I'm going to start making bad decisions if I don't eat." He started the car. "There's a diner on Calvert. Is it good? It's adequate and fast, and they have breakfast all day." "That's what I want," she said. "Adequate and fast." He pulled out of the parking structure and drove toward Calvert Street and thought about the fact that the ordinary, unheroic shape of sitting in a diner booth eating eggs after a hard morning, was what the past 3 years had mostly looked like. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the regular texture of 2 people who had started as a debt and an obligation and had become, through the gradual accumulation of ordinary time, something neither of them had planned for. He didn't have a word for what they were yet. He'd been working on not needing one. The annual Tech Forward Gala happened every November. Ethan had attended the previous 2 in his capacity as Director of Executive Security, which was the professional reason, and also because Charlotte asked him and he didn't want to say no, which was the actual reason. He'd stood in the background both times, watching the room with the operational attention that was by now so automatic it didn't feel like work, and had spent most of each evening managing the specific discomfort of being in a space that his body still associated with the worst night of his recent life. The 3rd year was different. Charlotte came to him about it in September, 2 months out. She came to his office, which she still did several times a week, and she sat in the chair across from his desk, the one he'd finally adjusted to the right height, and she told him that the foundation was going to make a major announcement at the gala. 3 years of data, the employment program numbers, a new federal partnership they'd spent 8 months negotiating that would significantly expand their housing subsidy reach. And she wanted Ethan on stage for it. He looked at her. "On stage? You've been on stage before." The press conference was different. I was standing at a podium with talking points. You threw out the talking points. That's the point. He leaned back in his chair. "Charlotte, the work speaks for itself. You don't need me on stage. I need you on stage because you're the reason people trust this foundation." She held his gaze. "Not me, not the brand. You. When families come to us, when they fill out those intake forms and show up for those first appointments, they come because they saw a man on a stage 3 years ago who said he was one of them and meant it." She paused. "I'm not asking you to perform. I'm asking you to be there." He looked at the window. The September afternoon was doing something complicated with the light. "It's the same room," he said. "I know." "The same ballroom." "I know, Ethan." He was quiet for a moment. He didn't have a clean argument against it. The discomfort wasn't the same as a reason. He understood the difference between not wanting to do something and having a legitimate objection to it, and he'd been making that distinction his whole adult life. "Okay," he said. She nodded. She didn't celebrate it, which he appreciated. She just nodded and moved on to the logistics, which was the right thing to do. He told Emily about it that evening, at the kitchen table, over the remains of dinner. She looked at him across her plate with the expression she'd recently developed, the one that was somehow simultaneously 8 years old and 40, the legacy of a kid who'd had to hold too much too early. "The same room?" she said. "Yeah." She considered this. "Are you scared?" He thought about it honestly. "A little." She nodded slowly. "That's okay," she said. "You were scared after the first time too. You just didn't say it until later." He looked at his daughter. "You noticed that?" "I notice most things." She pushed a piece of broccoli around her plate. "I'll come, if you want." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She looked up. "I want to." He thought about her in the hospital waiting room, her school hoodie and her untied sneaker, the deli sandwich she'd brought for him, and the one she'd given away to a stranger. He thought about her at 11, with her measuring looks and her rock collection and her world map on the wall. "Yeah," he said, "I'd like that." The night of the gala arrived with the particular quality of November evenings in Baltimore, cold and clear, the city looking its best because the dark hid the parts that needed hiding. Ethan had been at the venue since 4 in the afternoon running the security protocols, which was appropriate and also gave him 3 hours to walk the ballroom before the guests arrived, to stand in the space and let it be what it was now rather than what it had been. It was the same room, same marble floors, same draping light fixtures, same dimensions. The stage was in the same position. The service corridor where he'd been working on the electrical fault was still there, behind the same set of double doors. He stood in the center of the room at 5:15 in the afternoon, in his good suit rather than his gray uniform, and looked at the stage and let the room be both things at once, what it had been and what it was, without trying to choose between them. Marcus Reed found him there. They stood side by side for a moment. "You good?" Marcus asked. "Working on it." "You want me to run the stage position tonight, or do you want—" "You run stage. I'll be in the room." Ethan looked around. "I want to be in the room." Marcus nodded. He understood the difference without it being explained. That was one of the things Ethan valued most about him. The guests arrived at 7. By 8, the room was full. 3 years' worth of foundation supporters, corporate partners, the federal representatives who'd been part of the partnership negotiation, and because Charlotte had specifically extended invitations, 14 veteran families who had gone through the foundation's programs and had agreed to come tonight. Ethan had been involved in the outreach for those invitations, and he knew their names and their cases and their specific stories in the way, you know, things you've worked on personally. He moved through the room doing his job, tracking, assessing, making the regular rounds that were second nature now. And he stopped once at a table near the east side of the room where a man named David Carrera was sitting. Former Army. 2 kids, 9 and 12. Had come to the foundation 14 months ago with 4 weeks of runway before losing his apartment. Was now employed as a logistics coordinator at a mid-sized shipping company in Jessup, in a job that had been built partly around the skills assessment the foundation's employment team had developed, the one that translated military experience into civilian language, that made the invisible visible to HR departments that didn't know how to look. David Carrera had sent the handwritten card. "My kids have a bedroom again." Ethan stopped at his table. David looked up. "Mr. Brooks?" He started to stand. "Don't." Ethan pulled out the chair beside him and sat. "How are your kids?" David settled back. He had the look of a man who was still getting used to things being okay, the slightly watchful quality of someone whose nervous system hadn't fully received the news that the emergency was over. Ethan recognized it. He'd seen it in his own mirror often enough. Marcus just made honor roll, David said. Alicia's doing this thing with Robotics Club. A small, real smile. She built a thing that's supposed to sort Legos by color. It sort of works. Sort of? It works about 70% of the time, and then it just stops and makes a noise. Ethan looked at him. That's a good start. She doesn't think so. She's already redesigning it. He paused. She said she's going to work in technology. I told her she's 9. He shook his head slightly. She told me that wasn't relevant. Ethan smiled at that. A real one that got to his eyes. I know a few people who can talk to her when she's older. David looked at him. I don't know how to... He stopped. Started again. I wrote you that card. I know. I didn't know if anyone read it. I read it. Ethan met his eyes. I keep it in my desk. David was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table. I was 3 weeks away from losing everything, he said. I'd done everything I was supposed to do. Came back, tried to transition, did the resume workshops, did the job fairs. Nothing was sticking, and He stopped. I had this moment where I thought, I spent 8 years keeping other people safe, and I can't keep my own kids in their apartment. His jaw tightened. That's a particular kind of bad. Yeah, Ethan said. It is. The lady at the intake, Janet? Janet Osei, yes. She sat with me for 2 hours. She didn't rush me. She treated it like my situation actually mattered, like I was a person, not a case file. He looked up. I hadn't felt like a person in a while. Ethan held that. He didn't try to wrap it in something. He just let it be what it was. I'm glad you're here tonight, he said. I'm glad I'm here too. David looked around the room. It's different from where I was imagining I'd end up. He paused. Better different. Ethan stood. He put his hand briefly on David's shoulder, the way you do with someone whose situation you understand and whose dignity you want to respect. Enjoy the evening. He moved on. He had a room to watch and a stage to get to. Charlotte found him near the back wall at 8:30, 40 minutes before the program started. She was in a dark blue dress and her hair was down, and she looked like someone who had prepared extensively for this evening and was now carrying it with the earned ease of a person who had done the preparation and trusted it. How's the room? She asked. Clean. Marcus has stage covered. We're good. She nodded. Then she looked at him. The direct look. The unmanaged one. How are you? I'm okay. He meant it more than he'd expected to. I'm actually okay. She studied him for a moment, the way she did when she was verifying rather than just accepting. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her. Good. He looked at her. Charlotte. What? He'd been working up to something for a while. Not anxiously, not with the specific agony of a person dreading a conversation, but with the careful intention of someone who wanted to say a thing correctly because the thing mattered. After tonight, when this is done, he paused. I'd like to take you to dinner. Not a work dinner, not a foundation thing. He held her gaze. Dinner. She was still for a moment. The ballroom moved around them. 400 people, the ambient current of conversation and movement, and in the middle of it, she was very still. I was wondering when you were going to get there, she said. He looked at her. You were waiting? I was being patient. She held his gaze. There's a difference. He thought about 3 years of coffee and porch chairs and courthouse parking structures and diner booths, and an evening in her study with rain on the window where he'd said yes to something that changed everything. He thought about the way she hadn't looked away when he said Rachel's name. He thought about the way she'd told him to hold his ground in that board meeting, not because she was managing him, but because she wanted him to be effective, which was a different thing entirely. Yeah, he said. There is. Yes, she said. Dinner. After tonight. He nodded. She nodded. And then the logistics of the evening reclaimed them. Her toward the stage to check with the program coordinator, him back to the room to run his final sweep. And they moved in opposite directions through the crowd, the way you do when the ordinary machinery of life reasserts itself after a moment that didn't need to be larger than it was. At 9:15, Charlotte took the stage. Ethan stood at the back of the room, his back to the wall at the same position he'd been occupying for 2 years at this event, and he watched her speak. She was good. He would never stop noticing that she was good at this, the specific skill of making a room feel like she was talking to each person in it individually. She presented the numbers. 3 years of data. Over 200 veterans placed in civilian employment. 47 families moved from transitional or unstable housing into permanent homes. The Child Care Subsidy Initiative covering nearly 100 families in its first operating year. The new federal partnership that would expand their geographic reach to 12 states by the following year. She presented all of it clearly and without inflation, and the room received it with the particular quality of attention that responds to evidence rather than performance. Then she introduced Ethan. He came up the stage stairs, the same stairs, on the left side of the stage, that he'd taken in a different direction 3 years ago, and stood at the podium and looked at the room. 400 people, 3 years removed from the worst night in this ballroom's recent history, looking at the man who had been an anonymous maintenance technician the last time they'd been assembled here. He thought about what to say. He hadn't prepared remarks, which Priya, who was still at Kensington Dynamics and had long since accepted that Ethan was not a prepared remarks person, had noted with the patient resignation of a woman who had stopped fighting certain battles. He looked at the room. He found Emily, who was sitting at a table near the center with Lily beside her, both of them watching him with the focused attention of people who are invested in an outcome. Emily had her chin in her hand. She looked like her mother and like herself simultaneously, which she always did, which still did the thing to his chest that it had always done. He looked at David Carrera's table. David was watching him. He looked at the stage floor briefly, at the exact spot where he'd gone down 3 years ago with a bullet in his back and a child in his arms, and the working assumption that he was probably not going to survive the next hour. The marble was the same marble. The light was different, or maybe just his relationship to it. 3 years ago, he said, I was fixing a light in the hallway behind this stage. That was my job. I was good at it. I was going home to my daughter when I was done. He paused. I want to tell you something about that, about who I was that night, because I think people have a version of it in their heads that isn't accurate. The room was quiet. I was broke, he said. Not dramatically broke, not a crisis, just the specific quiet broke of a single parent doing math every month and making it work, but not by much. I had a maintenance certification and a second-hand couch, and 3 years out of a military career that had defined most of my adult life, and I was doing what a lot of veterans do after they come home. I was managing. I was getting through. I was not falling apart, but I was also not thriving, and I had mostly made peace with the distance between those two things. He looked at the room. There are about 1.9 million veteran households in this country with dependent children. I don't know exactly how many of them are managing in the specific way I was managing. Not falling apart, but not thriving, and having mostly made peace with the gap. But I know the gap exists because I lived in it, and I know what it costs, not in dollars, and the daily tax of being competent and experienced and capable, and having none of that recognized by the systems you're trying to re-enter. That is its own kind of invisible wound, he paused. And I know what it takes to close it. Not heroism, not a dramatic event, just someone who looks at you and sees the person rather than the gap, and gives you the next thing you need. He thought about Janet Osei sitting with David Carrera for 2 hours. He thought about the card in his desk drawer. He thought about Marcus Reed's threat assessment framework that had existed in a drawer for 2 years before anyone looked at it. This foundation exists because a terrible thing happened in this room, he said. I'd rather it didn't exist for that reason. I'd rather the reason was that someone looked at those 1.9 million households and said this is unacceptable and built something without needing a crisis to justify it. But that's not how it happened, and I'm not going to rewrite it. He looked at the room. What I can tell you is this. The reason this foundation works is not because of what happened on that stage 3 years ago. It's because of the people who work in it every day, who sit with families in intake appointments, who build employment assessments, who make calls and do paperwork and follow up again. They're the ones doing the work. I just told the story. He looked at Emily. She had unpropped her chin from her hand and was sitting straight, watching him. Lily was watching too. My daughter kept a map, he said, a physical map, covered in colored pins, one for each family we'd identified in our first research phase. She still has it on her wall. She never took the pins out. He paused. She said it's where we started. I think she meant it should stay visible. I think she meant that it matters to know where you began. He looked at the room one more time. We started with 412 pins. We're at over 2,000 now. We're going to keep going. He stepped back from the podium. The applause that followed was not the contained, polite applause of a formal program, but the louder, less organized kind that happens when a room is responding to something that found them unexpectedly. He walked back down the stage stairs and didn't look back at the podium, and he moved through the applause the way you move through weather, not fighting it, just going through it until he was on the other side. He found Emily at her table. She stood up when she saw him coming, which she didn't usually do, and she put her arms around him, which she also didn't usually do in public because she was 11 and had opinions about public displays of affection. He held her for a moment, her forehead against his shoulder, his hand on the back of her head. "That was good, Dad," she said, muffled against his jacket. "Yeah?" "Yeah." She pulled back and looked at him with her mother's eyes and her own face. "You didn't do the thing." "What thing?" "The thing where you make yourself smaller so people feel less uncomfortable about you." She looked at him steadily. "You didn't do it tonight." He looked at his daughter, 11 years old and already in possession of an observation that had taken him 35 years to arrive at. "No," he said, "I didn't." She nodded, satisfied, and sat back down beside Lily, and the two of them immediately resumed a conversation he'd apparently interrupted, and the evening moved on around them. Later, after the program ended, after the guests began their gradual departure, after Marcus checked in with a clean final report and the security team ran their post-event sweep, Ethan stood near the back wall of the emptying ballroom and looked at the space. The caterers were already moving through the room, clearing tables with efficient professionalism, and the lights had been brought up to working level, which removed the drama and left just the room, just the architecture, the marble, the bones of a space that had been the setting for the worst, and in some way he couldn't cleanly account for, one of the best things that had ever happened to him. He didn't try to resolve that. He'd stopped trying to resolve it some time ago. Some things held contradictions that didn't collapse into single meanings, no matter how long you looked at them, and the right response was not to force the resolution, but to hold both things and keep moving. Charlotte appeared beside him. Her heels were in her hand. She'd been carrying them since 10:30, he'd noticed, walking the room in her stockinged feet, with the particular relief of a person done performing. She stood next to him and looked at the room. "Good night," she said. "Yeah." "David Carrera cried during your speech. I'm not telling you that to make you feel anything. I just—" She paused. He was trying not to, and he couldn't. Ethan looked at the stage. "I know," he said quietly. "I saw." She was quiet for a moment. The room continued its transformation around them, from event to empty space, from occasion to aftermath. "It's a different room now," she said. He considered that. He thought about standing in it at 5 in the afternoon, letting it be both things at once. "It's the same room," he said. "We're different." She looked at him. The look was the unguarded one, the one that had taken 2.5 years to become consistent, and it held something that didn't need to be named tonight. "Dinner," she said. "Dinner," he agreed. They walked out of the ballroom together, through the lobby, out into the November night. Baltimore was doing what it did, imperfect, honest, unheroic, fully itself. The cold hit immediately, and neither of them had a coat, because their coats were in the car, and neither of them moved to get them yet. He looked at the city. She stood beside him. Emily and Lily had gone ahead with Marta and would be back at the apartment watching something they'd been lobbying to watch for 2 weeks, and would be very much asleep by the time either adult arrived, which both adults knew and had tacitly arranged. "Can I ask you something?" Charlotte said. "Yeah. If it had been anyone else in that hallway that night, if it had been a different maintenance technician who didn't have your background, who didn't see what you saw." She stopped. "Do you think about that?" He'd thought about it, more than he'd told anyone. The specific contingency of it. The particular chain of coincidence that had placed him in that building that night, in that hallway, with that background, facing that direction when the room changed. Sometimes, he said. And? He looked at the city. And I think that there are a lot of people walking around right now who could have done something similar if the moment had found them. People with the training, with the instinct. Former service members in maintenance uniforms, in security guard uniforms, in construction vests. People that nobody sees, he paused. I think the extraordinary thing isn't that someone was there who could act. I think the extraordinary thing is how many people like that are invisible until something forces them into view. He looked at her. That's the whole point of the foundation. That's the thing I keep trying to say. She held his gaze in the November cold. You're better at saying it now than you were. 3 years of practice. Emily helped. He smiled. The real one, that had been getting easier. Emily helps with everything, whether you ask her to or not. Charlotte looked at the street. She was quiet for a moment in the working way. I don't know what I expected, she said finally, when I sat outside your hospital room for 4 days. I don't know what I was expecting to happen. She looked at him. I don't think I expected any of this. I didn't either. Is that okay? He thought about the question. He thought about Rachel, who had always told him he made his best decisions when he wasn't in a hurry, and about the fact that he hadn't hurried this, hadn't hurried any of it, had let it take the 3 years it had taken to become what it was. He thought about Emily's map on the wall. It's where we started. Yeah, he said. It's okay. She bumped her shoulder against his once, briefly, which was the kind of small thing that carries more weight than the gesture accounts for. And then she said, we should get the coats. And he said, yeah, we should. And they went to get them. The story didn't end in the ballroom, though the ballroom was where it had started. It ended in ordinary places. In a kitchen where Emily was explaining to Lily why her method of loading the dishwasher was objectively superior, in a foundation intake office where Janet Osei was sitting with a veteran who needed 2 hours and someone willing to give them, in a desk drawer where a handwritten card said, "My kids have a bedroom again," in a scarred hand holding a coffee cup in an early morning, in the particular weight of a life that had been broken and repaired and broken again and had come out the other side not fixed exactly, but functional in a way that accounted for all its damage. Ethan Brooks was not a hero. He was a man who had done something fast and instinctive in a terrible moment, and who had then done something harder and slower in all the ordinary moments that followed, who had shown up, stayed present, held his ground, let himself be seen, allowed 2 kids and 1 woman and a room full of strangers in intake offices to matter to him in the specific ways they needed to matter. He had not saved anyone by being extraordinary. He had saved someone by being in the right place with the right eyes open. And then he had spent 3 years making sure that the thing he'd found in himself in that ballroom, the capacity to see what needed doing and do it, didn't disappear back into a gray maintenance uniform and a service corridor and a life that was managing but not thriving. That was the actual story. Not the footage, not the headline, not the 17 seconds that 47 million people had watched. The actual story was everything that came after, in all its imperfect, uncinematic, ordinary weight. And it was still going.